Hey everyone, we're in another AI conversation, and I'm happy to be joined today by someone whose work has impressed me from day one. Clara Hawking. Welcome to AI Conversations, and nice to have you.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah. So, Clara, for those who I'm sure you're already quite famous to many people, but maybe for the benefit of those who haven't heard of you or haven't seen your work, maybe just a brief background. What do you do, and what work do you do, particularly in education?
Yes, so I work as the head of artificial intelligence for a world leader in education called Globe Educate. We have more than 60 schools in 4 different continents. We have responsibility for educating more than 35 students, and we consist of schools from kindergarten to 12. So we work on fundamental and primary education as well as secondary education. And apart from that, I also do proactive research in artificial intelligence with a focus on generating meaningful and human-centric AI policy and regulation for the future benefit of humanity. And my particular area of interest is how do we make this safe for children? How do we create AI and use AI in such a way that it will also protect and safeguard our children and our schools?
Yeah, that's very interesting, Clara. And one of the things that drew me to your work was you shared a LinkedIn post that you made recently. Actually, going to provide a link in the video description, and you talked aloud about the significance of the next generation of workers like Gen Z, and at the same time, Gen Alpha, who are basically the children of the millennials. They're going to they're now in the schools, and they're now getting exposed to basically the limitations and maybe potentially the opportunities of alternative education. And they're getting born in a world that's completely technology driven, unlike the rest of us. We kind of remember that era before analog gave way to digital, right? So we still remember that. But for the Gen Z, increasingly large members of Gen Z and also Gen Alpha, they will never remember that. They don't know that. So from your perspective, what is the significance of this, and what are the implications of this from an education standpoint, and of course the role of AI?
It's a really good question. I think it's an all-important question, and I hope it's one that consumes the minds of school leaders around the world. How do we manage to move the generation of analog teachers into a space where they can support children who have grown up as what we call digital natives, children that have always used technology as a part of their life? And that space is a difficult transition now because curricula around the world is based on the knowledge and expertise of a generation who didn't have that type of access to technology. So there's no question in my mind that there is a dire need for education reform. There's a need for rethinking what are the skills of the future that our alphas, that our beta children, what will they need? Because those skills, in my optics, is not currently in our curriculum for the students. The time, what we call the factory model of education, when the children were sitting in long rows, and in some schools are still sitting in long rows, listening to a teacher in the front of the classroom, giving them knowledge. Those times are coming to an end because the technology will allow for the children to access the knowledge faster using their technology. And so what they need is not, in fact, knowledge. They have access to that. They need the ability to decipher what type of knowledge is important for them to meet their learning outcomes and to develop the skills that they need in order to fit into the future careers. So I think to summarize that thought, I think that there's work ahead both for public officials and for school leaders to have cross-global conversation about what a meaningful curriculum would look like for the children. And as you mentioned, our first generation of tech natives, our Gen Zs, are already in the school.
Yeah, I see this also as a member of the academia myself. In recent years, one thing that caught me interestingly by surprise is kind of the massive pushback, at least we see it in the Philippines, of teachers and schools against AI. And it looks rather mundane, at least to me. Like people are arguing about, you know, students cheating on their essays. Let's just focus on that little thing, right? And that speaks to exactly the point you're bringing up, where we're past the point where we need kids to memorize information that they can easily access online. They can Google that stuff, or they can get that from any large language model. But there's less emphasis on kind of interacting with that information, understanding that information, and maybe it just tells me that the essay does not hold up, against that lens. I could be wrong, obviously. So maybe one question that comes to my mind, assuming that's the case, and let me know if I got it wrong, is are our teachers even equipped to deliver that, that kind of reform in education? Because certainly they were products of that factory model as much as, it's being forced upon our kids today. So in many ways, we need to retrain our teachers. Would you agree, or is that kind of the perspective that you share about all this?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I have for more than a decade, I think, shared the narrative that upskilling is needed. Get back to learning skills. You need to get with the technology, and there wasn't really an audience for those conversations. There were people wanting to hear it, but not wanting to initiate acting on it. And so when you ask, are teachers equipped to do it, it's not an easy to answer question, because on one hand, if we only look at technological skills, ability to use technology as a pedagogical tool, no, they're not equipped to do that. They need significant upskilling and retraining in order to figure out how can we use all of these different tools in a way that's meaningful for the children. And one example of how we know that training and upskilling is an important point to prioritize for school leaders in schools is to think back when computers first made their entry into the classroom. Schools were quick to buy 20 iPads for the classroom or 20 laptops, but nobody took the time to think about what's the pedagogical outcome of this? What is it that we're hoping to facilitate in terms of learning for the children? So we ended up having all of these tools, many of them that were left simply just not used, and many of them that were used in an ineffective way, where children sort of disappeared behind their laptops and not learning anything. With that being said, I am optimistic, and one of the reasons why I'm optimistic is actually the experience we had in the global educator community during the pandemic, where schools closed down and everybody were completely unprepared. What do we do now? And what we saw around the group around the globe were really incredible initiatives for teachers to collaborate. They were going into social media, starting groups, trading resources that could be used digitally. We had tech companies moving quickly to facilitate the type of technology that schools needed. We had countries quickly designing national learning programs so the children could watch school from home, and so on. And so I think that seeing how the teachers under such enormous pressure and relentlessly long work days having to completely shift everything about how they were teaching and thinking about what was working and wasn't working, it gives me a lot of hope that even the most resistant teachers will have an interest in learning how to use this technology once I think everyone comes to the acknowledgement that it's not going away and it's going to be part of our future.
Yeah, I mean, just on that anecdote you shared, what strikes me is kind of it's kind of a double pressure that needs to happen, right? While we're adjusting to kind of the evolving educational needs of a digital native. That's a given. Let's say that's a given. We now need to also constantly focus on upskilling kind of the digital migrants who are the teachers of the natives. So it seems like there's a double gap because there needs to be this new crop of I don't know, progressive educators that will deal with both cohorts, and it's going to be kind of a I don't know if it's an uphill battle, but it's going to be at least a phased approach for many countries. Some countries will probably do it better than others. Like I'm particularly impressed. I keep citing this narrative about Finland and when they made the decision to teach 1% of their population and now 1% of the EU. I don't know how far they've gone with that second phase, but I think they did phase one very quickly. 1% of Finns within a year we taught AI, and then now 1% of Europeans taught in AI. That was very impressive, very deliberate. I don't know if such a thing is possible, at least within that span of time in other countries. So anyway, more to my question, focusing on let's focus on the new needs. So you mentioned in your article, Generation Alpha, are screen agers. They're it's a cool term, I think. So they're the first generation growing up in an entirely technologically advanced world. The Gen Z sort of had an inkling of it, of what the old world looks like, but they were very young. Now that they're in the workforce, they're completely native. The millennials sort of have that kind of 50-50 existence. And for the rest of us, we spend more of our lives in the kind of the old world, and we're like, migrants to this new world. So back to Gen Alpha, how do you envision their educational needs? What makes them what makes them different, or what's kind of some of the top things that we need to be mindful of when educating the Gen A's?
Yeah, good question. So I think one thing we need to be very mindful of is what we already know about biological factors in brain development. We know that there are stages of brain development where certain kind of information coming into the brain develops the brain in a certain way. So I think that the first thing for us to really think about is what is age appropriate for us when we think about technology. And we know that the kids, the alphas that are coming in already now, many have smartphones, many have, even as babies, been sitting with with mom and dad's iPhone and scrolling through pictures and listening to little videos. So that has been a normal space for them to be in. What hasn't been a sort of normal space for them to be in is an analog space, a space where there is no technology. And one of the things that I wanted to initiate a discussion about in terms of that generation of children and the coming generations of children is that analog existence is not going to be intuitive to them. It's not going to be their first choice on the shelf of choices that they have in their supermarket of experiences. They have grown up always turning to the technology. One example is what we see here, the development around mental health. We know that mental health for our youth on a global scale is declining, and we see the numbers go up by a huge margin. And one of the ways that the different organizations are responding to this is by using more technology, apps, well-being bots that they can talk to, and so on. And while that technology is great, it further immerses the children into the world of the digital. And so what I wanted to address in the article is that we're going to have adults who don't have an intuitive understanding of the analog world in the same way that Generation X and older generations have. and that there will be a need in the future to have someone who actually understands how to live well, making a bridge between experiences that are analog and experiences that are digital, and optimizing those experiences for our children.
So is this the role of the analog education specialist? You might have mentioned that in your article. So these are like the translators, if I'm picking it up properly, those who can bridge, or not necessarily just bridge, but kind of remind the kids that, okay, you're having fun in digital land, but there's certainly still a role that analog education plays in their development. So is that where you were headed with that concept?
Yes, exactly. So, for instance, we know that some of the recommendations for our kindergarten students and up to third grade is that they're really only exposed to technology no more than 30 minutes a day. But we also know that they are exposed to technology for significant longer times than that every day. And so something happens there in the brain development when you are growing up and you become a screenager, and that is the world, that's your social world, that's your connection to your community. And so there will be a need to facilitate the other direction. So this is that generational shift. And there will be a need for someone to say, what's the value of playing with clay? What's the value of making a school garden and harvesting your own vegetables from the school? What's the value of using real paint instead of using Midjourney or Leonardo, or do your work in Stable Diffusion? What's the value of these analog experiences where we play together, where we climb together, where we are outside? I think those experiences for our generation seem self-evident. Sure, that's important, but for the future generation, it will not be that way. Because that isn't the world. So it's really important that we continue to think about what kind of analog experiences are relevant for education. What is it that the students learn? And we have to keep in mind that the future teachers will not know that. They have to learn that, which is why it will be a specialty area to understand the different age groups, what are meaningful interconnections for them, where they get to touch and feel in real life and not online.
Yeah, that's an excellent segue. Obviously, these are very progressive thoughts. And I think many, as I mentioned offline earlier, I was able to speak with Father Beltran, and also link that video in the description, who's achieving a similar outcome with out of school youth in Manila, really catering to digital natives. So these are people who never finished their high school diplomas because they got bored. And then what they're doing is they're smashing all of these credentials digitally from IBM and all these other, gamified education providers. And they're getting certified in data science, in blockchain, in cybersecurity. And I think it's I guess nothing short of a miracle that he was able to find a structure that recognizes these credentials in kind of a more traditional sense, like their equivalency to a high school diploma, and then makes them employable. So I think that's an interesting, if not, temporary stopgap while we, go through this transition. But I think on a broader note, you raise a very good point that we need, new types of specialists, new types of educators to usher in this new era. So, can I ask you more about your role in Globe Educate, and especially, I'm very intrigued by your position as the head of AI. So, can you talk a little bit about Globe Educate, what it does, and then how your role as an AI leader supports that mission in Globe Educate?
Yes. So Globe Educate is an organization of more than 60 schools, and we work together on facilitating world-class education for our students in bilingual schools, in many different countries, and we have multiple curricula from the international baccalaureate, the European baccalaureate, national curriculum, the Ontario curriculum out of Canada, and so on. So we are a really diverse organization, but we share the same objectives. The primary objective for us, what's always in the forefront of our minds, is how are we keeping these kiddos safe in our organization? What measures can we put in place to safeguard our children? So that is always our first priority. But our value, or one of our values, is that we want to raise children up in the schools who feel that they're capable of going out into the world and making a difference. So one of our creeds is that we want to shape the world. And my role as head of artificial intelligence is to help shape AI in our organization, but also create an environment in which our educators and our children feel that they have some agency in shaping AI, some agency in how it will be embedded into curriculum, both for students and for teachers, to be part of these conversations, to initiate that Globe Educate sets the pace for other schools to come to us for collaboration, to help with figuring out how do we do these things in our school. We are very active in promoting a sense of creating a greenhouse for artificial intelligence, meaning that we want to encourage our different schools to initiate artificial intelligence. And we are also running multiple initiatives ourselves, and we'll continue to run pilot projects. One initiative that we're kicking off right now is A Einstein, where we have 12 schools that are going to be building a robot using 3D technology. Then they will use creative writing to design the story that the generative AI needs to design a personality for the character, the historical character that they are choosing. And then the robot will be able to interact. And the robots at the 12 schools are interacting together. I think it's a good example of how we think about AI in terms of rollout. We don't want to scale everything right away. We want to run these initiatives, and then we want to collect the data, and we want to evaluate the data, so that we're always making decisions for our schools where we're thinking, is it safe? Are the children learning? Is this the objectives that we wanted them to learn? And then we can scale it to the rest of our schools. So that's part of the work that I'm doing in terms of future. Is also I'm running workshops and webinars for our school leaders and for our educators, and I am facilitating the building of a training platform, a training strategy for our teachers, that they will continuously need retraining and upskilling. And every educator will have completely different needs and many different languages in which they need to learn. And so that's a project that we're working on to really see if we can institute a way to do this meaningfully and share it with our colleagues in school organizations around the world as well, so that we have an open collaboration with other school organizations.
Yeah,
In addition to that, I just wanted to mention also that it's really important for us to design meaningful policy and regulation about how AI is used in the classroom, and to standardize how it is used. And one of the reasons why that's a major issue for me to work on, and I'm really pushing on, is because we are already seeing around the world that teachers are experimenting with generative AI in the classroom. But some of the standard safeguarding procedures that are in place, teachers may not be aware that they are still needing to be in place for generative AI. What happens when we let the children use them? Do we have parental consent? How is the data collected? How is the child's privacy protected when they're using generative AI? All of these questions are still a little bit hazy out there. A lot of conversation, as you mentioned, had been about cheating. But I think that that's actually a lesser issue than all of these issues around how we keep the children safe and using the technology, and why are we using the technology to begin with? What are we hoping to achieve? So that's a sort of broad picture of some of the things that I'm working on.
No, that's an excellent. Really, it's really. I'm really amazed in the sense that there's already some people who in the education sector are quite progressive, and it seems like you already have tremendous momentum on your side. So I'd like for our audience to learn more about how you're doing it. You mentioned policy. I want to attack this two ways. First is maybe from a more personal note. So I noticed from the Globe Educate website, as the head of AI, you have a computer science background, but you state that you have an emphasis on ethics. And just to contrast, just as a straw man argument, just to contrast, I heard in another event, uh, a prominent data scientist from the Philippines, so it's just not mentioned who it is, but says that ethics is a gap, at least from the perspective of curriculum. Data science and STEM people are not necessarily grounded in ethics. I certainly disagree, of course, but let's just use that as a straw man. And then we have someone like you, master's in comp sci, head of AI, but with an emphasis in ethics. So how was how was that journey for you in terms of your own educational and academic background? What led you to this emphasis on ethics, and what do you have to say about, was ethics part of your educational journey? Is that something you had to come up with on your own?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and you get to one of my favorite subjects. What would be a useful background for someone that works in technology? And as you mentioned, there is a debate about whether developers and people in tech in general have enough of an exposure to ethics. My educational journey actually started in psychology with an emphasis on organizational psychology and peace and conflict resolution. And that's where I think I first merged into starting to think about how do we even make decisions, and how do we do that on a global scale? How do we communicate? How do humans communicate with each other in a way that is meaningful, and in a way that is mindful of all of the different aspects of what it means to be a human being. And so when it came time for me to choose my first master, my first master's degree was in practical philosophy and applied ethics. And because I like technology, my research revolved around a plant in Ireland where Dell Computers were employing migrant workers from Poland. And so it was a sort of a nice intersection of this thing about we're developing technology and we need these plants and we need all of these computers because suddenly everybody is going to have one at home. But what's the impact on human beings? And that thought about how does it impact our community? How does it impact humans? How does it shift what it means to be us as a species? I couldn't let go of that. So it's really something that I stuck with through my educational journey. I then took a master's degree in peace and conflict as well to kind of get a little bit of a better development around how to analyze these types of issues. But I was quite enamored with technology, and so I started to then prepare myself for the future, the world that it will look like in 10 years and 20 years, and the way that the world will look throughout my lifespan, because I wanted to be able to be part of it. And so I finished my second master and then hopped into my third master, and this time in computer science. And because I work in education and I'm so passionate about educating our K-12 kiddos, I did my work, my research work around learning management systems, and again, with a focus on how to make them inclusive, not just to teachers, but to the parents, to the children who are using them in a world that's becoming increasingly global. And I was no more done with that before I realized that I've got to run faster because artificial intelligence is developing quickly. And so there was no master at the time in artificial intelligence in the human-centric area that I wanted to work in and within ethics. So I had to simply just take lots of different master's courses individually in different types of machine learning and understanding that narrative taking place where is the ethics in all of this. So I became very involved in different research groups and became very involved in speaking at different events on artificial intelligence and the role of ethics. And as part of the work, also, I'm doing research with the Center for AI and Digital Policy in Washington, D.C., working in a more structured manner towards making comprehensive suggestions about how do we regulate this. And as I mentioned before, for me, the concern is the children, but under the umbrella of the children, there are many individual areas that one could look at in terms of ethics, things that have simply not been included in development thinking. One of the things is the privacy of the children. Another is that, if it's scraped data that is used to feed the machine, then it's also dirty. It's toxic data that needs to be cleaned. Is it cleaned well enough to ensure that it's not getting to our children? How are we using the tools? What's the actual life machine balance, the human to computer interaction for a child? Where's the research that tells us when it's safe for a child to start using this technology and how to use it? That's also a sort of broadly unanswered question. Other issues are around bias in our machines. We know it's devastating for an adult to experience that artificial intelligence can't recognize your face because it has a different shape or a different color than the machine thinks that a human ought to have, or when it designs digital humans that all sort of look like different colors of a Caucasian person. There's no representation of the real picture of what human beings look like around the world. And kids are seeing that output of these bias models, and there's no regulation around this. And then another, of course, big issue, which is devastating to mention, but I think we simply cannot ignore, is the development of deep fakes and artificial images, where I can take your voice and your image and I can create videos of you that can be very intimate and compromising and fake, but it can't be detected as fake. And we see, regrettably, that this technology is already being used very efficiently in the dark web by organized groups that are using it to kind of weaponize their intent, mixing these fake child images with real child images and making it almost impossible to detect. And I think, considering the increase that we see in this material, we're talking images by the millions, we need to also be very vigilant about having these conversations with our parents, with guardians, with teachers, with school leaders, and policymakers need to be working quickly. In the UK and in the EU, for example, where is the area where I'm geographically located, there is still no law. Holland is the only country that actually emphasizes the need for a point of law on deep fakes. And so it's going very slowly. So to summarize that is that do developers, do tech companies know enough about ethics? They probably do, but is it a priority? I think maybe it's not. I think this is not a job that we should leave to tech companies about safeguarding. I think that we need regulation because technology companies, they are there to compete, to make money. They are not there to think about all of these other things. And even with their best efforts, we're not seeing that they're successful. If anything, that's what we learned from social media, that it's causing real harm to children, and it was never regulated in the proper way. So now is our chance to act and act quickly on making meaningful, safeguarding, reformative regulation around AI, and that is why I'm in the ethics.
No, that's excellent. And if I can track back to kind of your own personal journey, it sounds like you were already deep into the social sciences, you're already deep into the humanities, and you caught up by getting your master's in CS just to catch up. So I'm not saying that's the only way, but it seems to be a very good way to kind of bring the ethics conversation into the STEM discussion. And well, we all know we need more of that. But I want to focus instead on that latter point you mentioned. So Center of AI and Digital Policy, certainly a really good role. So any immediate thoughts about how AI policy is evolving or should evolve in the context of education, especially? Where do you see the kind of the levers? Because there's so many other issues like copyright and all these other things. So specifically for education, where do you see that evolving? And then you did mention that distressing phenomena of deepfakes, certainly an impressive technology from a creative standpoint, but it's obviously prone to abuse. So where do you see that intersecting with education policy?
Yes, really, really a good question. I think that one good example of how I think of it is that the African Union has joined the work with the G20 on developing meaningful AI policy and regulation. And one of the reasons why that's so important is that this material is now being sent around to all of these African nations where everybody gets a chance to kind of weigh in on what they think is a greater concern so that we get a representative picture built into the policy. So these major global communities of going through this work and making it as transparent as absolutely possible so that the public can see what's being debated, the public can follow the development of the policies, I think is a very important example of how I also think about policy. It should be a live document that is transparent and that is revised often because the technology is going to be developing very quickly. We have technology in use in schools now that we don't really have a meaningful understanding of how to respond to. One thing could be something like a deepfake image of a child in a compromising situation. A school leader might ask, should I sanction this image the same way as I would sanction if it had been a real image? Because there's no law essentially saying that the image itself is illegal, but the child has encountered harm because this image is being circulated around. What do I do? And I think that's this is sort of a common, a more regrettably more common case that school leaders say, what do we do? And one of the things that's very important for us as an educational organization is to address this with our AI policy, and so that we can support our schools in what to do, keeping a safe footing forward, but also guiding the schools through it. But no matter how hard we work as an educational organization, we can never do the work that regulators can do by creating legislation, to creating meaningful global policies, to creating national policies where countries work together. We saw very early on that Italy said, oh, no, no, we don't want this, and then realize that maybe they were a little too quick there. I think it's initially tempting to say, stop it, don't use it. But it is a lost fight. We are using it. It is there. The children are using it. It is part of their life. So policy has to address all of those lingering questions about, okay, but how do we keep the kids safe? How do we protect them from malicious actors? How do we protect our political systems from the disinformation that's being produced? How are we ensuring that the children are getting information that we can say with some confidence is true, and so on? So and again, how do we make sure that the children then can use it in a way that their data, that their private data, is not scraped and used to train more AI? I think those are things that should be part of the conversation, and it can only be part of a conversation through collaboration, cross-national, cross-global, cross-continent collaboration on piecing this together.
You know, I'll mention something very rhetorical, but I remember in a recent discussion on kind of the negative effects of, let's say, social media, and again, and AI is part of that. We would liken it to something akin to kind of weapons of mass destruction, if you think about it, but on a more subtle basis. And we know that international treaties around these weapons were brought out because of global crises. Like a world war had to happen for us to ban, biological warfare, or similarly for us to ban human cloning. So at that level, everyone universally agrees this is bad. But for some reason, and I'm not, maybe drawing false equivalence, but AI and social media seem to kind of dodge that, even though you have explicit evidence already. You have what happened in Myanmar with the Rohingya genocide. You have the polarization in social media, the proliferation of deepfakes. These are sociologically, I would say, equivalent to kind of like weapons of mass destruction. But we sort of collectively allow it to proliferate. It's rhetorical, obviously, but I don't know at what level of crisis do we really need to acknowledge that these things need deliberate effort. And it seems like, let's just talk about copyright as another straw man. In the same week that Japan said AI off limits to copyright, very opposite stance from the EU with that preliminary AI Act, right? So it seems like no two countries agree about kind of the universal harms some of these tools have, and vice versa. What are the universal benefits that we need to maximize? So it's like everyone's doing it in a very organic way, and maybe that's the nature of some of these technologies. But wow, certainly the harms can be magnified if we don't kind of collectively put our foot down on this. Anyway, just a thought.
I think
So,
it's
yeah.
interesting in the same when it comes to education. I think an interesting case there is how the international baccalaureate curriculum and the advanced placement, the college board reacted, where the IB was very early to come out and say, yes, there's generative AI, and here's what we're thinking about it, and here's what students should do, here's how they can use it in their work. And the American College Board said, absolutely not. We completely forbid it. And here we have two major college preparation organizations saying completely different things.
Diametrically
and I think
opposed.
that exactly highlights the point you're making, that everybody is winging it. But I also think that initiates a next train of thought. What are we good at when we need to make decisions? We're good at making decisions when we have good data, when we have good research, when we know how things work, not intuitively, not trigger finger, not what we think is a great idea or what's engaging or what looks like a great new toy. What actually is the data telling us? What's the research telling us? And I think that highlights the need for us to really get serious about using data. Schools, for instance, have been notoriously poor at using their data, yet they collect amazing data every single year, incredible data on all sorts of different aspects of childhood development, but it's not used to make informed decisions. If we're going to have a meaningful way forward with AI, and we do need to find that meaningful way forward with AI, we've got to use our data. And I think that some call data the new gold of the future. I think that that's right. I think that there's also another debate there around what does it mean to have value? Well, data is valuable, but it's valuable for us in terms of making decisions. Is it also valuable in terms of business? Yes. But we need to know what's out there, and we're missing a lot of these research pieces and the connection to what data we already have, the research we've already done, and the knowledge that we already have about what it means to live as a human being with technology.
No, that's a fantastic perspective. I'm just realizing we're at the hour. You know, these things never last long enough. So maybe obviously we will probably need at least one more follow-up at some point. But first I want to thank you for sharing your insights. Maybe a few more words, takeaways for the audience before we sign off. And yeah, you know, appreciate your time in the podcast, Clara. So, you know, last words before we go.
Yes, well, first and foremost, thank you so much for having me and taking the time to have this conversation. I really appreciate it. These are incredibly important and still subjective things. It's hard for us to grab a hold of all of it, but we won't get there if we're not having these conversations with each other and collaborate with the knowledge that we have. I think if there's some closing words for me, thinking about what AI means, it would be words that I think I would want to say to educators around the world who are in that crossroads right now, because most of the educators are still from a generation that grew up without technology. And we see that some educators have jumped right in and they have embraced it and they're having fun and they're sharing resources and they're playing with this new educational technology and thinking about how to use it in their classrooms. We also have many teachers who are really unsure, who are unsafe, who are nervous about what to do. And for them, I would say, look towards your leadership and encourage them to get educated on helping facilitate this change. That's a major priority for us, is to create a psychological space where an educator can make this transition and determine whether they want to use technology. This technology and the different tools is not for every educator. There are subjects that where it maybe is not meaningful to use it. So think about who you are as an educator. What's your pedagogy? What is your learning outcomes? And can the tools optimize them? If they can, great. If not, think about another way of working with it.
Yeah, and with that, I think that's a really good place to end it for now. Thanks a lot, Clara, for gracing AI conversations, and I hope to have you again. And we'll definitely be keeping tabs of your work as it progresses. Yeah, I hope to see you again next time.
Thank you so much. I hope the same. Have a really nice day.